Through ice-rimmed binoculars, British officers strained to pierce the Arctic darkness as they approached occupied Norway. Their ships had been pitching and rolling through towering seas for 3 days, with 500 seasick commandos crammed in the holds below. 24 hours ago, they were spotted by a German reconnaissance plane. Undoubtedly, the enemy would have more than enough time to prepare a devastating welcome. Yet, as the Lofoten Islands emerge from the pre-dawn gloom, something seems terribly wrong. The harbor lights are still burning brightly, as if the Germans haven't received or haven't believed the warning. It almost seems too good to be true, and maybe it is. Either these commandos are sailing straight into a trap, or they really are about to pull off the perfect surprise attack. Background. In late 1940, the momentum of World War II lay firmly with Nazi Germany. Though the RAF had successfully put Hitler's invasion plans on ice at the Battle of Britain, the Wehrmacht occupied most of Europe. U-boats were wreaking havoc in the Atlantic, and the British Army was still recovering from its evacuation at Dunkirk. Prime Minister Winston Churchill knew that if the Allies were to turn the tide of the war, it would require more than simply defending Britain's shores. They would need to actively strike back on Nazi-occupied soil. A prime target was Norway. Since invading in April 1940, the Germans had converted the extensive Norwegian coastline into a vast naval base for the Kriegsmarine, its complex network of fjords and channels providing the perfect hiding place from which to strike at Allied convoys in the Atlantic. What's more, the country's industries provided crucial resources for Hitler's war machine. Among the most valuable were the fish oil factories, which produced glycerine, a vital ingredient in explosives manufacturing. Britain's failure to protect Norway from the German occupation had been a bitter pill to swallow. Now, Churchill decided it was time for revenge. The Prime Minister knew exactly the right men for the job. In June, he had issued a directive calling for the creation of a new elite unit specialized in attacking occupied coastlines, comprised of, quote, specially trained troops of the Hunter class who can develop a reign of terror along these coasts. Taking their name from the Boer commando guerrilla militias the British Empire had faced in South Africa at the turn of the 20th century, the 2,000 volunteers from across the armed forces who made up these new commandos would also adopt their tactics, which British strategist Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark described as, quote, hit sharp and quick, then run to fight another day. By early 1941, plans were underway for No. 3 and No. 4 Commando to carry out the first large-scale raid on occupied Norway, Operation Claymore. Their target would be the Lofoten Islands, around 900 miles from Britain. Located above the Arctic Circle, this archipelago was home to numerous fish oil processing plants, which also meant it was a constant hotspot of German shipping activity. Yet the mission's objective was not just to deal a blow to the Third Reich's supply network by destroying the factories and vessels. It was to demonstrate that Britain could and would strike at will anywhere along Hitler's supposedly impregnable coastline. Preparation and journey. On February 21st, the task force assembled at Scapa Flow. 5 destroyers of the 6th Destroyer Flotilla, HMS Somali, Bedouin, Tartar, Eskimo, and Legion, would escort 2 newly converted infantry landing ships, HMS Queen Emma and Princess Beatrix. On board would be 500 commandos, a detachment of Royal Engineers for demolition work, and 52 Norwegian sailors who could play a key role as guides and interpreters. Under the command of Rear Admiral Lewis Keppel Hamilton, the flotilla first sailed to the Faroe Islands for final training. However, by now, naval planners had identified a serious challenge. The shallow waters around the Lofoten Islands meant the destroyers wouldn't be able to approach closer than a mile to shore. As the commandos practiced extensively with their landing craft in similarly harsh conditions to those they would face in Norway, the reality of the mission sunk in. They would have to carry out the raid without the benefit of covering fire from the Navy. On March 1st, the British ships departed for Norway. The 3-day voyage proved brutal. Adding to the discomfort of the biting cold and having to share extremely cramped conditions below deck, the severe weather led to widespread seasickness among the commandos. Even experienced sailors struggled as their ships pitched and rolled in the rough seas. With no way of controlling the weather, the men had to find ways to make the difficult journey more bearable. Suffering from nausea on the first day, the officer in charge of No. 3 Commando, Brigadier Dunford Slater, was told by his ship's captain to, quote, drink a bottle of beer each morning, plus cheese and pickled onions. This remedy was reported to have been effective, but the British force would soon have a more serious problem to worry about: the emergence of a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft overhead. Having been spotted with 24 hours still to go until their arrival, the commandos feared the enemy would have enough time to get a substantial force ready to greet them with heavy fire. The men braced themselves for the German welcome party. It looked like things might get ugly. Landing. As they steadily approached the Lofoten Islands in the early hours of March 4th, the ship's officers peered through their binoculars to see if they could detect the scale of the German defenses. To their amazement, they saw the harbor lights burning brightly, a sure indication that the enemy was unaware of their imminent arrival. Whether the reconnaissance report had failed to get through to the commanders of the German forces in the area, or they hadn't believed that the British vessels would be involved in a raid on the islands, or there simply weren't enough troops available nearby to make resistance worthwhile, the situation looked more promising for the commandos than they had first thought. At 6:45 a.m., the landings began. From Queen Emma and Princess Beatrix, landing craft carried their assault teams towards 4 separate targets: Stamsund, Henningsvær, Svolvær, and Bretisnes. Lieutenant H.J.C. George, the operations senior landing officer, who had sailed from New Zealand specifically to join the war effort, later described the harsh conditions, saying, quote, "It was terribly cold, 4 feet of snow down to the water's edge, and the spray froze on everything, icicles all round one's tin hat." The frozen sea spray on the ramps of the landing craft caused them to become extremely slippery, making disembarking far more dangerous than it had been in training exercises. Nevertheless, within 5 minutes, the entire commando team had made it onto the shore. The force's arrival was not completely unopposed. Lurking nearby, the German armed trawler Krebs sprang into action, launching an attack on the destroyer HMS Somali. However, after firing 4 rounds, it was swiftly dispatched. The sinking of Krebs yielded an interesting and unexpected bonus. In the vessel's final moments, its commander, Lieutenant Hans Kupfinger, managed to throw his Enigma coding machine overboard, a desperate bid to prevent the Allies from getting the chance to study the key to the German secret communications. However, before he could dispose of the Enigma's spare rotor wheels and code books, British forces boarded the sinking ship and recovered the crucial items. With Krebs dealt with, Somali and her fellow destroyers were free to turn their sights on the German supply ships in the harbor, which they began sinking. Through naval gunfire and demolition charges, they sank 18,000 tons of enemy shipping. Among the enemy vessels sent to the seabed were Hamburg, Passies, Felix, Ellenau, Riesen, Ando, Grotto, and Bernhard Schulte. Meanwhile, the commandos made their way inland with practiced efficiency. Some locals, seeing uniformed men in the streets, initially assumed it was some kind of German training exercise. As they realized these were Allied forces, the Norwegian civilians demonstrated their support, even providing hot ersatz coffee for the raiders. Soon, the commandos began systematically blowing up the German-controlled facilities in the vicinity. The British were worried that their destruction of Norwegian property would be controversial, but Captain Martin Linge, one of the 4 Norwegian officers participating in the raid, had already addressed such concerns with characteristic directness, saying, quote, "If they are loyal Norwegians, they will take it well. If not, it really doesn't matter." The Lofoten's cod boiling plant was quickly demolished. 2 factories at Henningsvær and 13 at Svolvær were reduced to rubble. In total, the raiders destroyed 11 fish oil facilities and set 800,000 gallons of oil ablaze. Columns of thick black smoke rose thousands of feet into the Arctic air, visible for miles across the frozen fjords. As the raids progressed, the commandos even found time for audacious gestures of defiance. From the telegraph office at Stamsund, Lieutenant R.L. Willis sent a telegram addressed to one A. Hitler of Berlin. His message to the Führer was pointedly sarcastic, quote, "You said in your last speech, German troops would meet the British wherever they landed. Where are your troops?" Yet the mockery of Hitler's exaggerated boasts about the strength of his Atlantic Wall didn't end there. Lord Lovett, leader of No. 4 Commando, took some of his men to a nearby seaplane base, traveling there on a local bus to flaunt the ease with which they were able to move around the island. The base commander, unable to do anything to stop them, later complained that this constituted what he described as, quote, "unwarlike behavior." He even reported the incident to Hitler himself. However, the commandos weren't the only ones engaging in mischievous antics. When the celebrating British raised their flag, some local children seized the opportunity to snatch it as a souvenir. Their alarmed parents, fearing Nazi informants, were forced to hide the flag under a stone fence in Festvik for the remainder of the war. Even possessing such an item could bring severe punishment. Today, the flag hangs in the Lofoten War Memorial Museum. Within a few hours, the mission on the islands were complete. By 1 p.m., both landing ships had re-embarked all their forces and began heading for home. They were joined by 276 prisoners, 216 Germans and 60 Norwegian Quisling collaborators, as well as 314 Norwegian volunteers, eager to join the Norwegian Free Forces, including 8 women. Lieutenant George remarked on this unusual situation with amazement, commenting, quote, "Fancy women on board a warship in action." The ships were even able to provide a ride back to Britain for an English pharmacy manager who had been stuck in Norway since the German occupation. Aftermath. The success of the raid lifted spirits back home. After landing in Gourock in Scotland, Chief Petty Officer Robert Meadows was approached by an eager local reporter seeking details about the operation. The journalist offered to buy him a drink, but finding the pubs closed, had to find another way to secure the photo opportunity he had in mind. Taking him to a restaurant, he bought the closest visual substitute he could think of for a beer, ordering, quote, 2 tumblers to be filled with tea without milk. A few days later, Meadows' photograph appeared in local papers with the caption, quote, "And here's to us," a sailor having a welcome drink after returning from the successful Lofoten operation. Meanwhile, Churchill quickly hailed the mission as a great success, offering the men, quote, "Congratulations on a very satisfactory operation." Back in occupied Norway, the consequences were far more complex. The Germans, enraged by both the destruction and the warm welcome their attackers had received from locals, launched brutal reprisals. Houses were burned, and families of those who had fled were beaten and jailed, with 64 Lofoten Islanders becoming the first inmates of the infamous Grini prison camp near Oslo. Hitler himself was particularly incensed by the raid. He was fully aware of just how important Norway was to his plans, describing the country as, quote, "a zone of destiny." Determined to deter future attacks, he ordered the construction of 160 new coastal forts and the deployment of tens of thousands of additional troops. By 1944, the German garrison in Norway would swell to 370,000 men, a massive force that would remain largely inactive while the Allies advanced elsewhere, exactly as the British had hoped. For the commandos themselves, Operation Claymore proved a turning point, demonstrating how a small, well-trained force could strike the enemy where they least expected it. The cost had been remarkably light, just one accidental, self-inflicted wound to an officer's thigh. Yet some commandos expressed disappointment at the lack of resistance, feeling the hazardous duties they had volunteered for had gone untested. Nevertheless, having proved their effectiveness in the raid on the Lofoten Islands, No. 3 and No. 4 Commando would go on to join the 1st Special Service Brigade, playing a crucial role in the Normandy landings in June 1944. The raid's most significant legacy lay in those captured Enigma components from the German armed trawler Krebs. These items, quickly dispatched to Britain's top-secret code-breaking establishment at Bletchley Park, revealed the Kriegsmarine's home waters key for February and helped cryptographers decode German naval traffic sent between March 1st and May 10th. While the immediate tactical success made headlines, this intelligence coup would have a far greater strategic impact, helping protect Allied convoys in the vital Atlantic shipping lanes for months to come. Interestingly, some commentators have suggested that the whole operation was a so-called pinch raid, a mission in which the acquisition of German cryptographic equipment was in fact the primary objective. Whether this theory is true remains a matter of debate, but what is certain is that Operation Claymore demonstrated the vulnerability of Hitler's Atlantic Wall while providing crucial intelligence that would help turn the tide of the naval war. Perhaps most importantly, it proved that even in the darkest days of World War II, Britain retained both the capability and the courage to strike back at Nazi Germany.